Right. Welcome to the virtual BSR. This is a lecture joint with the Society of Renaissance Studies, and we are delighted to be able to continue our joint activity with the Society of Renaissance Studies. And Richard Wistrake is just about to tell you more about that.
Thank you very much, Chris. Well, it's a great pleasure for me to be here, even though I'm sitting in Hastings in South England with the snow falling gently outside the window. So just briefly, to tell you something about our relationship, the Society of Renaissance Studies was founded in 1967. We're an international forum for all who have an interest in any aspect of the study of the Renaissance. And we support the study through financial support for conferences and public engagement activities. We award postdoctoral fellowships, and we also have a number of publications, including our flagship journal, Renaissance Studies, of which tonight's speaker, Professor Jennifer Richards, has just finished a long and distinguished stint as editor. We've also recently launched a new studentship scheme to support scholars of colour to undertake master's degree studies in Renaissance topics at any institution in Great Britain or Ireland. We've had a long and very happy connection with the British School at Rome. One of the highlights is our jointly sponsored annual lecture, of which tonight's is the latest. And I'm delighted to be able to use this occasion to announce the latest step in our collaboration, the launch of a new studentship that will allow a British or Irish doctoral student to spend 3 months as a fellow of the school in order to work on their research project and to enjoy all the benefits of the school while they're here. We hope that the first SRS BSR doctoral fellow will be in residence during 2022. And on that note, I'd be very happy to pass back to Chris, who's going to introduce Jennifer Richards to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, it's an enormous pleasure to do this. So Jenny, Professor Jennifer Richards is the 9th speaker from the Society of Renaissance Studies, as far as I can work out. And she is certainly one of the most distinguished. She's Joseph Cowan Chair of English Literature at Newcastle, and she runs Newcastle University's Humanities Research Institute, and she's got a huge back catalogue of really significant books. Rhetoric and Courtliness in Early Modern Literature. You know, there aren't very many people working on the 16th century who could get away without reading that. Rhetoric, a New Critical Idiom, and most recently, Voices and Books in the English Renaissance, A New History of Reading, 2019, which won the 2020 European Society for the Study of English Biennial Award for Literatures in the English Language, of which there are, of course, quite a number of potential books. Quote from another prize after Richards' book, Historians Can No Longer Neglect the Persistent Presence of the Voice Within the Culture of Print. And I also want to stress that she's general editor of the Thomas Nash Total Publication Project, which is immensely important AHRC funding. In fact, she's connected with the AHRC. She's on the AHRC advisory board, as I know well. She's an all-round star, and so I'm going to pass straight over to her. What's going to happen is that she gives her lecture, she shares her screen and so on and so forth. She stops giving her lecture and I run the Q&A. But I'm not going to be able to see anybody. So can you put questions in? Can you put questions in the Q&A setting at the bottom of your screen? And then at the end, I'll be able to collate these questions and ask them for you. That's the only way of doing this, and I'm sorry that we can't actually see you all, but of course there are really rather a lot of you. So seeing you would just be impractical under any circumstances. So I'm now going to mute my own screen and pass straight over to Jenny.
Okay, thank you very much for such a generous introduction. I'm going to try and share my screen with you now. Hopefully you can all see that, and I'm just going to get the slideshow started. Right, so I assume that if anything goes wrong, then Chris or Richard will reveal themselves and wave furiously at me.
I sincerely hope so.
Okay, good. That's good to know. So, well, first of all, thank you so much, Society for Renaissance Studies, for nominating me to speak today, and to the British School at Rome for making this possible. I gave a presentation at the British School at Rome in 2018 as part of a tour of the HRC funded Thomas Nash project, which Chris just mentioned. And we did that to celebrate the launch of a film by one of your 2018 fellows, the artist Anna Brass. So that's a clip from the film. And that film, just to give a plug to Anna, the wonderful Anna, that film was her elegiac study of Nash's final work, Lenten Stuff, 1599, and the city that harboured him, Great Yarmouth in Norfolk. Much of the talk that I gave then is, well, some of the talk that I gave then is now part of my most recent book, which was also mentioned, Voices and Books in the English Renaissance, which explores the neglected voice training of Tudor readers in the schoolroom, the idea of voice-aware silent readers, and what happens to print when we bring our physical voices to it. And I should say, in relation to that book, I'm especially honoured to have Richard Wisterike on this call. Richard knows very well that none of that would have happened without our collaboration many years ago. But the question of that book, what happens to print when we bring our physical voices to it, was also a question that Nash was thinking through as well. And it is relevant to the printed book that I want to discuss today, which is full of voices. My talk today, though, will seem very different from the talk I gave all those years ago, not only because I'm speaking remotely. I'm at Hadrian's Wall, otherwise known as Newcastle upon Tyne in the northeast of England, an outpost of the Roman Empire, not at its heart today, but because I will swap a well-known pamphlet writer from the age of Shakespeare, Thomas Nash, for a little known, or if I'm perfectly honest, probably quite unknown, English clergyman from the 17th century, a chorister and a teacher of grammar, rhetoric, and music, who wrote a manual for beekeepers. His name is Charles Butler. His date's 1560 to 1647, so he lived a long time. And there are just some of the books that I will be mentioning in my talk. Butler is probably best known for the scientific insight he brought to the study of Renaissance bees. He confirmed the sex of the queen bee, and he did so through close observation in an apicultural rather than a laboratory context. However, it's not Butler's contribution to science on which I will focus in this paper, but his humanist encounter with the sounds he heard. Sound and meaning are my themes today, and to clarify which sound I'm interested in, I don't know whether you noticed, but I gave myself a little subtitle, Voices and Bees, and I would ask you to forgive me for the almost pun. Butler shares Nash's interest in the relationship between voice, emotion, and understanding, and he shares his belief that the printed book can communicate this because he was a product of the same education as Nash, and that education is what I would call acoustic humanities. The difference between them is that Butler's focus is on the voices of bees. Okay, Voices of Bees, I think that's a very strange subtitle. It's a bit bizarre, I think. I do realise that my interest in Butler's preoccupation with the voices of bees may seem like a step in the wrong direction, a turn from scientific enlightenment back to fable and fiction. I'm well aware that I risk underplaying Butler's contribution to apicology and overplaying his anthropomorphism, a concept that we are routinely told by both scientists and animal humanists is bad. want to give you in a moment a few examples just to remind you how poorly anthropomorphism is regarded. And you might want to keep these in mind through the lecture. One is expressed by the entomologist John Kennedy and the other by the humanist Tom Tyler, one trained in chemistry, biology, the other in history and philosophy. In the introduction to the new anthropomorphism, Kennedy is keen to remind us that it has taken many centuries to achieve the present measure of emancipation from vitalism and anthropomorphism, and he laments that it is making a return in science. He acknowledges it is currently impossible to eliminate a way of thinking that has been, quote, dinned into us since childhood, but he argues for the importance of a critical self-awareness of its risks in the face of a new swing, a return that is concealing the mechanisms that he says, the mechanisms that drive animal behavior, which he thinks is the proper subject for animal scientists. Tom Tyler, in contrast, complains that the problem with anthropomorphism is that it always starts with the human. His background is very different to Kennedy's, but he shares the same concern that anthropomorphism risks occluding what we need to know. If by relying on the notion of anthropomorphism, he argues, we preclude the possibility of recognizing or discovering new kinds of human-animal continuity, we are condemned to a particular kind of anthropomorphism which restricts what we can think about both human being and about the being of other animals. And I'll leave it for you to decide whether I'm falling into that trap in this lecture. But let's go back to Butler's emphasis on the voice. By voice, he means, of course, the buzz of the wings of bees beating at more than 200 times a second. He's especially interested in the sounds that the rival queen bees make, the virgin queens make in the hive, the tooting and quacking. The tooting sound is made, the entomologist Thomas Seeley explains, by a virgin queen moving about on the combs in the hive, and it triggers a lower pitched quack by another virgin queen confined to her cell, signaling to the roaming queen that she has lethal rivals, prompting her either to leave with a secondary swarm, known as an after swarm, or to stay at home to kill her competitors. Should we describe the buzzing as voicing? Bees don't have a voice box, nor do they have ears, unless you're Butler, who thinks that they probably can hear wrongly because he likes their music, let's say. What they have instead, it is thought, is an extraordinary sensitivity to vibration, that is to sound waves. And the queen, like the workers, is able to produce sound by pressing her thorax, her chest area, against the substrate and activating her flight muscles. In her book, Bees, Claire Preston recalls the remarkable work of a BBC sound engineer, Edward Farrington Woods, whose invention of the apodictor in 1952, an instrument which measures and records the sound of a beehive, enabled him to establish that the workers and the drones had different wing beat frequencies, and they hum at 250 hertz or 190 hertz, respectively. Today, we recognize that it is acceptable only in children's fables to give bees a voice, a distinctly human trait. For example, in an English version of Aesop's fable of the bee and Jupiter, printed by William Caxton in 1484, the bee prays to the god Jupiter, quote, in this manner: God Almighty, I pray thee that thou wilt give to me and grant that whosoever shall come for to take away my honey, if I prick him, he may suddenly die. This sounds like a very reasonable bee to me. The granting of this request comes, though, with a nasty sting in the tail. Jupiter insists that a stinging bee must die too. Now, to give a more modern example from a recent children's book aimed at the under fives, bees are given wings to buzz and a mouth with which to speak. And what do they say? Well, you can read for yourselves. These pictures are from The Honeybee by Kirsten Hall and Isabel Arsenault. The bees in Butler's 1609 edition don't speak. The Feminine Monarchy is a manual for beekeepers, and it is full of information about how bees behave. Explaining bee behavior is Butler's aim. He wants to help his readers look after their stocks and harvest honey. But his understanding of bees follows classical precedent. They are depicted as tightly knit political communities. This opens the door to a long tradition of bee anthropomorphism, and it highlights Butler's interest in humans. The bees live in orderly and hierarchical communities. There are workers, drones, and of course a queen, since all communities, in Butler's mind, need to be governed. This idea of bee royals has a very long history. And I like Jonathan Wolfson's suggestion that Butler was able to accommodate the female bee because he had grown up in the age of Elizabeth I. But what really catches my attention is the way this book on animal behaviour becomes an advice book on human behaviour. The bees are attributed virtues, valour, fortitude, chastity, temperance, and cleanliness. And it is advised that good beekeepers adopt them too if they want to get on with their bees. The idea that bees live in political communities is still with us today, even among scientists, although we might understand their structure differently. I'm thinking about the wonderful book by Thomas Seeley, from which I've been quoting already, Honeybee Democracy, 2010. He says, inside each teeming beehive is an exemplar of a community whose members succeed in working together to achieve shared goals. He rejects the idea that a colony is governed by a benevolent dictator, Her Majesty the Queen. Beehives, he argues, are democratic communities, and his book studies how bees make collective decisions, for example, when they swarm to find a new home. What distinguishes Butler from Seeley, however, is not just their methodologies. Seeley studied chemistry as well as biology in the 20th century. Butler studied grammar, rhetoric, and music in the 16th century. But the degree to which they are comfortable explicitly moralizing their subject. I'd argue that moralizing is implicit in Seeley's study. For example, in his approval of the decision of one of the most influential entomologists of the 20th century, Martin Lindtower, previously a young soldier in the German army who fought on the Eastern Front in the 1940s before he was seriously wounded, to join a post-war world, quote, where people create rather than destroy. But the real difference between them is the discourse they employ to describe how honeybee colonies communicate intelligence to make decisions, as Seeley would put it, or make emotional appeals, as Butler puts it. Both are interested in bee communication. Both see it as an appropriate focus for scientific study that will enable understanding. But Seeley's bees make collective life or death decisions through democratic debate. The debate rests on the waggle dance of scout bees searching for a new home for a colony. They communicate the quality of better sites, future homes, with livelier, longer waggle dances. A swarm wait to receive the evidence comparing the liveliness or quiescence of returning scout bees. So that's Seeley. Butler, in contrast, gives his bees, and the queen's especially, an expressive voice. His bees express emotion rather than convey information. So just want to set up the question that I'm exploring in this paper. The first one is this: is there any value in Butler's emphasis on voice? That for me really is the key question I would like to explore. What might his analysis of bee behaviour through acoustic humanities offer scientists working on the emotion-like states of invertebrates today? Scientists like my colleague, Melissa Bateman, who contributed over a decade ago to work on the pessimistic cognitive biases of animals who cannot report on their subjectivity, i.e. they have no voice. Bateman's team focused on honeybees rather than mammals and birds. They first trained the bees to extend their mouthparts to an odor mixture predicting reward, so one with sucrose, and to withhold their mouthparts from a mixture predicting punishment. Then they tested their response by simulating an attack through sustained shaking. They observed the results and measured the chemicals produced: octopamine, the neurotransmitter that functions during reward learning, and dopamine, or serotonin, which mediates the ability to learn to associate odors with punishment. Now, they were not able to make any claims about the subjective feelings of the honeybees in the experiment, but they were able to call in question how we identify emotions in any non-human animal. Okay, to begin to start thinking about how I might answer my question, first question especially, I'm going to take you through the ways in which Butler gives bees a voice, including in highly problematic ways, to try to understand why he did this so insistently. My first example comes from the first chapter of the 1609 edition. If she, the queen, that is, the queen, go forth to solace herself, as sometimes she will, many of them, the other bees, tend upon her, guarding her person before and behind. They which come forth before her ever now and then return, and look back, and make withal an extraordinary noise, as if they spake the language of the knight marshal's men. And so away they fly together, and anon in like manner they attend her back again. If by her voice she bid them go, they swarm. If being abroad she dislike the weather or lighting place, they quickly return home again. While she cheers them to battle they fight, when she is silent they cease. I want to pause for a moment to consider the language Butler uses to explain bee behaviour. In this instance, he is introducing us to the queen bee and, I think, the female worker bees. He compares the bees to knight marshals, that is, to officers in a royal household. And I'd like you to note how he records what he thinks he hears and how he interprets it. This is an important theme of his book. Butler's study of their behaviour is both aural and visual. The result is most definitely an imagining of a bee colony as a royal palace, and this informs what he thinks he hears. The bees buzz as if they spake. A little later, the noise the queen makes becomes a voice that bids and then cheers. This is anthropomorphism, plain and simple. And I think it's curious that Butler is ignoring the advice in his cited classical sources, which are much more cautious about the use of terms like voice. Here is what Aristotle advises in The History of Animals. The book itself is quoted throughout Butler's book. He says, insects produce neither voice, phone, nor speech, though they produce a sound by their internal pneuma, not externally emitted pneuma, for none of them breathes, but some of them buzz, for example, the bee and other winged instants. Unabashed, Butler continues in his error, giving bees a voice, quite literally, in chapter 10 of this book, which is titled Of the Swarming of Bees and Hiving of Them. And that topic, swarming of bees, was also central to Seeley's analysis of bee decision-making, although he stopped short of giving them a voice. Now, I want to tell you a bit about swarming. And I'm going to turn to Seeley first. so we have a more accurate understanding of what is actually happening. Swarming is when a colony of bees splits into 2 or more colonies. It's a natural process by which honeybees protect and grow their communities, and it usually begins in the early summer, May, June, perhaps also July, as the hive fills up and food outside becomes readily available. Although, to be honest, I don't think anybody quite knows the exact stimulus for it. What we do have a good understanding of, however, is what happens in and outside the hive. The first step, Seeley explains, is that a colony rears 10 or more queens, all daughters of the mother queen. While they develop, the queen undergoes a change. She is fed less and less by her workers, who begin to show mild hostility towards her, shaking, pushing, gently biting. These bouts of rough handling, he explains, force the queen to keep walking about the nest. And it's in this way that the mother queen, usually too large and heavy to fly, is put into flying trim. So I'm quoting from Seeley there. The queen is slimmed down, while the worker bees are fattened up. And they are also warmed up by activating their flight muscles thanks to worker piping. The piping of the bees begins faintly, building up gradually to blast, this is the scout bees, I should explain, building up gradually to blast out the message, I'm quoting Seeley, time to warm up. And then a little later, time to go. And go they do, Seeley declares. Meanwhile, in the hive, there remain a few thousand worker bees and a dozen or so queen cells, many thousand cells of worker brood, and much food. The first virgin queen to emerge announces her presence by piping. The queens still in their cells pipe in response, producing lower pitched quacks that are somewhat longer than the first virgin queen's toots. These quacks almost certainly inform the first virgin queen that she has lethal rivals. And it's this stage, the one that I've highlighted on a slide, that Butler is interested in recording in his chapter. But his description of this drama gets key details wrong. Crucially, he misidentifies the speakers in the interactions he is observing and auditing. He thinks it is the princess bee who, as he calls them, the virgin queens who leave the hive to form new communities. In fact, as I've just explained, it's the old queen who leaves first to form a new colony. This mistake affects what he thinks he hears and how he represents it. He thinks he is hearing a young queen bee petitioning her mother, the queen bee, to be allowed to leave the hive. And this is what he says. Once the first swarm has left, there needs some other warning, which the rulers themselves do give by their voice, without which that stock will swarm no more that year. The next prince, when she perceives a competent number to be fledged and ready, begins the music in a begging tune, as if she did pray her queen mother to let them go, whereunto she yield consent by her answering. As to the petition of a second daughter, she seldom says nay, though sometimes she consent not in 2 or 3 days. Then look for a swarm. And he notates that voice thus. I'm going to return to this notation in a moment. For now, I just want to keep adding to Butler's catalogue of errors. He doesn't just notate the bees, he describes the meaning of the sound he hears. And like the student of rhetoric and music that he is, he gives it emotional meaning. The princess bee sings in a begging tone, or in the 1623 edition, so the second edition, she's heard singing in a mournful and begging note. So what I don't have time to do, but based on the collation of these 2 editions, what he does in the second edition is he adds descriptive detail to his interpretation of what he thinks he's hearing. Okay, so I've got to the end of this, what I've called a catalogue of errors. And I'm a little bit over, well, I'm over halfway through. At this point in my paper, I suspect I would struggle to answer the question I have set myself. Is there any value in Butler's emphasis on the voices of bees? But I'd like to change direction now to think positively about what we can learn from Butler. And I will be proposing we can learn 3 things. First, I'd like to emphasize that he gets some things right. He is listening, and he hears the tooting and quacking of the queen bees, as scientists now describe it. You will see the score consists of a 4-line staff with the letter G on the 2nd line from the bottom, indicating that this is a treble clef, i.e. the higher register of music. As Butler explains, the bees, and he shows us, the bees have different bees have different pitch, and that is meaningful to him. They're answering one another. Yes, he makes many mistakes in the way in which he describes what he hears. He misidentifies the actors and their emotions. He thinks he hears a princess bee pleading with her mother. In fact, he hears a roving virgin queen, and he hears the aggression. He is hearing, but not understanding, the aggression of her rivals. The activity is misrecorded, but the sound is not. The second thing we might learn, I'd like to suggest, focusing again on the second edition of 1623, is that Butler's anthropomorphism, despite his description of the inner experience of bees in terms of human emotions, does not, to recall Tyler's fears, quote, preclude the possibility of recognizing or discovering new kinds of human-animal continuity. Nor does it restrict what we can think about both human being and about the being of other animals. This is because in this edition, Butler develops his notation of the rival queen bee's piping in a new way, blending the sound with the voices of the singers in a madrigal called melissomelos, the Greek word for beekeeper. So this madrigal is scored for 4 voices: mean, soprano, contratenor, tenor, and bass. It's printed in the manner of a part book to be read by the 4 singers who sit in pairs on either side of a table. The bees don't sing, the humans do, animating what Butler mistakenly thinks is going on. Here are some of the lyrics. I won't read them out, but they're just there for you to take a look at and underscore what I'm about to say. The lyrics outlining that the princess bee begs her mother to depart. So he's simply repeating the same information that you find in the text. It's there in the song, but they're now in the character of Amazonian warriors. What interests me is what happens to the piping of the bees, now incorporated in the madrigal for human voices. Their sound remains distinctive, set apart from, but blended with and experienced through the human voices. In effect, the humans embody the bees' communication, lending it their voices. We hear it twice, first with a single voice, then later as a 4-voice chordal buzzing. And I'm going to try and play that for you just from a little bit, from the middle bit where they start the piping. So if it doesn't work, I'll do it myself. I think that worked. At least I hope so. I have to say, I've been practicing doing that piping to demonstrate it to you myself, but so much better to have that beautiful choir, professional choir. That's the parish choir of Little St Mary's, Cambridge. And if you wanted to hear madrigal, you can find it easily on YouTube. There is one other easily dismissed acoustic change in this book, which underscores that meaning for Butler lies as much in performance and audition as it does in observation. This change is to the notation, if I may call it that, I'm being careful here, so it's the notation of the human voice, and this happens in the 3rd edition of 1634. So I'm going to show you that now. If I can move. I might need to. Oh, yes, there it is. Okay, fine, you've got that slide. Okay, so this is the 1634 edition, and you will see that it's exactly the same as the 1623 edition, but it's in a new font. And Butler is using his experimental phonetic alphabet, which uses Saxon letters for the double consonants, CH and TH, and apostrophes to mark the place of omitted mute vowels. Butler was attempting to represent the sound of human speech, human language, more readily and accurately to the eye. So he's one of many spelling reformers. And he published this new alphabet in his English grammar in the 1630s. But like other attempts at spelling reform, so too this one failed. But the point for me is that over the 3 editions, 1609, 1623, and 1634, Butler sought to create a sound-conscious, an increasingly sound-conscious, animatable book in order to enable new understanding of bee behaviour and to show how humans might relate to that. At the start of this paper, I noted Butler's emphasis on the moral conduct of beekeepers, but he's also asking us to listen with empathy. And this leads me to my 3rd and final point. And here I am speaking directly to colleagues in the humanities, primarily to textual scholars, reminding them of the importance of sound to meaning. When I started my career as a literary scholar with an interest in the history of rhetoric, I understood I was studying a silent tradition. I sat in silent libraries, poring over books for years, imagining that I was working on other humanists, early humanists, people who, like me, were silent readers, studying books in closets and libraries, silent spaces. The research I did for Voices and Books in the English Renaissance changed my mind, and so did actually working with Richard Wistrike, who you heard from at the beginning of this paper. So it showed me that this is only half the story, this silent reading, and that the early readers in whom I am interested, male and female, boys and girls, men and women, had been trained in what I am now calling acoustic humanities, especially grammar and rhetoric. This has changed the way I think about reading and also how I think about books. I now see books, all books, as potentially animatable, although I do accept that some will sound better than others. One of the books that helped change my mind was a small school book on rhetoric by Omar Talon from the early 16th century. This book was popular, probably one of the most popular of the rhetorics in the Renaissance grammar schoolrooms across Europe in the 16th century, but it remains untranslated in any vernacular, well, certainly in English today, and understudied, dismissed as representative of the reduction of rhetoric to elocutio, the study of figures of speech, elocutio, that is, and study of delivery, pronunciatio. And people often say it's a very small book, so it can't be important, or people have said that. But I came to see this book as a 3D experience, and that its examples and meaning are brought to life off the page by the schoolboys who use and perform from it. So just to give you, I'm just going to give you one example. The reader is meant to pair a figure of speech in the first part of the book with an emotion and voice in the second part of the book, and then to perform it. So this is my one example of the figure exclamatio, oh, that expresses strong emotions, admiration, despair, hope, indignation, derision, misery, pity. When we turn to the second part of the book, we find out about which voices express which emotions to realize the emotion we want that figure to express. It could be pity is expressed with the voice that is yielding, full, broken, mournful, and then you can practice that. Anger is expressed with a voice that is sharp, full, interrupted. Fear is expressed with a terse and hesitant voice. Now, that's Talon's book. But what interests me is that Talon's book was given new life by Butler. His rhetoric of 1597, by far the most successful of his works, is a new version of Talon's Rhetorica. Now I think I'm ready to go back to the question I posed. Is there any value in Butler's emphasis on bee voices? What might Butler's analysis of bees through acoustic humanities offer scientists working on the emotion-like states of invertebrates today? Most obviously, Butler's sound experiment might be updated with more accurate information taken from the kind of experiments that Melissa Bateman and her colleagues introduced a decade ago. Or you could create an entirely new composition in collaboration with beekeepers today. But there's something else Butler has to offer too. He has reminded me that emotion is not, nor should it be, merely an object of study. It is also a means to understand life forms, however simple, their decision-making through embodied awareness. When scientists focus on the mechanisms that drive animal behavior, or argue that insects are more like, quote, complicated robots than little people, they're not actually taking the emotion or the metaphors out of science, they're just changing them. The problem, of course, with working so hard to be objective is that we can forget that the emotion is still there. And now to my conclusion, which actually is also, for me, a beginning. This paper has, I hope, given you an overview of my current thinking about this book, developed in conversation with colleagues across disciplines. I hope I have sufficiently acknowledged the limits of my knowledge and training, so I feel like a little bit of a fraud. Rhetoric is my thing, but I have needed to engage with musicology and think a little bit, find out a little bit about animal science. I'm at the start of thinking through a cross-disciplinary collaboration that aims to create an interactive digital edition of Butler's Bee Book, and also to explain his training in music, grammar, and rhetoric to understand why and how voice is so meaningful. I'm working with colleagues at Newcastle, fellow literary scholars, digital humanists, Tiago Souza Garcia, James Cummings, plus software developers, a musicologist, Magnus Williamson, who specializes in early part books, a composer, Bennett Hogg, and bioenvironmental scientists who are exploring emotion-like states of bees in laboratory conditions, including my colleague, Vivek Nityananda. There are many difficulties to overcome in interdisciplinary work on any topic, as we are finding. Finding a shared voice for artists, humanists, and scientists is a challenge. But on one thing, our team is agreed, that there's never been a more important time to nurture an emotional connection with bees. I'm sure the same for any subject, actually. And that means finding new ways to study them. And at the time of preparing this paper, I noted a flurry of articles in The Guardian about bees, including one notice on the 9th of January 2021 that the British government had sanctioned the use in England of a pesticide banned by the EU, which is known to kill bees. Is it enough to know that bees are among our most efficient pollinators and that as their numbers dwindle, they require special protection? Clearly not. Might we also need then to find new ways to nurture our emotional connection to them? I'd like to suggest that Butler, with his interest in listening and also blending the distinctive voices of bees and humans, it inspires us to at least try. Thank you very much.